Hi, you're listening to a student-focused episode of the Sociology Show podcast. If you're studying the subject at GCSE, A-level, foundation, degree, or any other discipline, then this podcast could be of help to you. If you have a question for the show, then you can email the Sociology Show podcast at gmail.com, and one of the teachers, lecturers, examiners, or experts will answer your question for you. You can sponsor the show on the GoFundMe page and subscribe on all the usual podcast platforms. If you're going to class, going to the gym, or just chilling, put your headphones in and let's be sociology geeks together, eh? Hello and welcome to the Sociology Show. The Sociology Show podcast is brought to you in association with Tutor2U, the exam performance specialist for A-level and GCSE sociology students and teachers. And so you can visit tutor2u.net/sociology, and there you can pick up revision guides and revision videos, flashcards, and everything else that you need for your A-level or GCSE sociology studies. And the focus of this episode is an introduction to postmodernism, and I'm delighted to welcome back Drew Dalton from the University of Sunderland. Hi, Drew.
Hi there. How are you?
Very good, thanks. Thanks for coming back and helping me out with this one.
You're welcome. Absolutely welcome. I enjoy doing these.
No, it's good. And I must say also a massive thank you, because Drew is one of the kind people that has helped sponsor the show through the GoFundMe page. And you gave a very generous donation, Drew. So I really do appreciate that.
Oh, you should always support sociology. Always.
Exactly. So we're going to talk all things postmodernism today, Drew. And I thought what would be quite useful is to, before we work out how postmodernism evolved, we kind of need to do a little bit of history before we get to postmodernism, don't we?
Yes. It's been one of those kind of, ironically for postmodernism, which I'll come to, it's been almost like an unfolding process in some ways. It's to go back a little bit historically, because I think you need to really know what modernism and modernity is before you can understand postmodernity. So going back to kind of, early kind of civilization and humans' development and the interconnectedness of them moving across the globe. What we saw in the kind of 16th and 17th centuries, we saw the kind of European settlements, didn't we, in places like the modern USA, and trade with India, those early seeds of kind of early, what you could call early globalization, really. And this idea of the kind of scientific expedition of human societies and the categorization of animals and people and the birth of the scientific method. And very much what come across in this kind of era was this idea of logic and reason and the scientific method, and this concept, I think importantly, of truth, that we can, find out the answers to the world's ills and the world's problems. We can use this method to unfortunately, which was used by the West, to civilize, inverted commas, other nations, which led to the advancement of colonialism and this idea of the West versus the rest, as Stuart Hall says. But I think what emerged in this time with this birth of the scientific method and this kind of quest for truth, because bear in mind, centuries beforehand, during the Dark Ages, ideas of truth-seeking through the scientific endeavor were crushed, weren't they, by in the West, by the Roman Catholic Church and the Spanish Inquisitions and all those types of things. You could be burnt as a witch and so on. But I think what emerged through this was this idea that faith in divine revelation and authority of the church was being increasingly undermined. And so we were starting to see the birth of what we would now call the Renaissance. And due to these kind of technological developments that started to emerge as a result of it, and thanks, as a little side note, to the Arabs who maintained Greek philosophy and scientific advancement alive whilst they were crushed by the church, these ideas come, flooding back again. And what eventually happened in this kind of process of this new modern era, or what we would go on to call modernity, we saw this growth of human civilizations, and we saw increasingly the West take a lead in this. And this was for several different reasons, largely because the invention of the steam engine within the UK meant that goods and the mechanisms could be taken across the globe, railway tracks could be laid, that interconnectability of people could happen. And, so we saw the birth of the Industrial Revolution. And, as you've probably talked about in the show before, at the same time, we also saw the birth of the middle class and the birth of capitalism as it started to really emerge as a global way of being. And so all of these things kind of came at this time of the Industrial Revolution, around the kind of 1830s to 1850s. And we saw, little minor things that actually have, when we talk about postmodernism later, have huge effects, like this concept of leisure time and of having, private space as family structures altered from agriculture to industry. And we saw huge social, political change at this time. And it just meant that this growing urbanization and this scientific method of being able to categorize these new groups of people through medicine and through psychiatry and all these things meant that we seemed to be on this route to human progress. And it wasn't relying on religion for answers. It was relying on science. It was about human progress and achievements and I use this term very loosely, at the time, it was viewed what man, inverted commas, has brought to the world in one fell swoop, wiping out half of human population. But it's this idea, and this is what modernism is about. There is an end goal in sight. When I teach it to my students, I always say, imagine a book that you're slowly reading through, and there's an end chapter at one point. And in this end chapter is the answers to everything. And that's the kind of modernist goal of science today, isn't it? To find a cure for COVID, to find cures for cancer, to find truth about why we exist. And it was believed by some people at the time that religion would eventually die out. That wasn't the case, but it was, early thinkers like Auguste Comte and the founder of sociology in the West believed that, we could determine social order scientifically and, all these massive ideas at the time about how science can be used to build a better world. So it sounds really optimistic. Would you say, Matthew?
Yeah, it does. It does.
But this, however, led to some problems. Obviously, this has meant that capitalism has spread wildly. It's been largely unregulated. Do we want to ask the question, and I think it's an important one, of has science always been in the benefit of humankind? Has medicine, for that matter? All of these huge institutions have arisen as a result of this. And this is what has led some authors, like Anthony Giddens and Zygmunt Bauman, to say that we've entered a new phase of modernity within the recent decades. So maybe from the kind of, it's hard to pinpoint, isn't it, with these things? But, from a roundabout post-World War II and onwards, we're entering a new phase where things seem to be accelerating rapidly. And capitalism has grown largely unchecked. And that's been because of, successive governments who don't want it to be checked. They want free trade and capitalism to emerge across the globe. And when we get to the stage, some people have called this a kind of high modernity or late modernity, I think Anthony Giddens called it. And so this is a new phase of modernity where we've gone into acceleration and overdrive. And what people like Zygmunt Bauman have said about it is that we've moved away from what we call a solid modernity, and we've moved into liquid modernity. And what Bauman really meant by this is that this period has been characterized in the world we're living in now by absolute unrelenting uncertainty, because you never know what's going to happen next. You don't know when the global economic crash will happen, maybe soon, the way we're going. This huge level of global change has massively affected us. And the world seems to be having increased levels of risk, don't they? Like, everything seems a bit riskier than it used to be. And so what Bauman meant by this in his work about liquid modernity was that when we look back, people viewed solid modernity as very ordered, very rational, very predictable, very stable. People seem to have jobs for life. You know, that type of stuff,
Yeah.
that narrative that the family, the nuclear family, always was, even though we know it wasn't, the way forward. Things seem to have a stability to them. And this is what Bauman talks about, the solid modernity. And the way in which it organized was that it was very bureaucratic. Bureaucracy was a way in which we could order the huge actions of large numbers of growing populations. However, this comes at a cost, doesn't it? The days of solid modernity took a bit of a shake, because bureaucracy can dehumanize us, can't it? It puts us down to a name and a number on a bit of paper. That tells us who we are and how we must act and what we must do. Do we call this, is this like the goal of progress in the past? What the modernists originally thought? Maybe not. And Bauman wrote a fantastic book called Modernity in the Holocaust, when he says that all of those wonderful idealistic things where we said we can use science and bureaucracy and reason and all these things to organize our societies actually were used in the most hideous ways. When you consider that the Holocaust itself was a product of modernity, claims Bauman. When you look at the efficient, rational way that we mass slaughtered over 6 million people using all those tools of modernity, the scientific method, the dehumanizing process that it does, the rise of the institutions, all just actually didn't make us more civilized. It didn't make us progress to that end chapter of the book. What it did instead, we used modern tools of modernity to become mass murderers. And Bauman throws that one up and says, this the outcome we had always wished for. And there's some really other good kind of late modern writers like George Ritzer, who writes about McDonaldization. Yeah. And how, this world is becoming this rational, ordered world where our choices are given to us. It's highly bureaucratic, and uses McDonald's as an example of that. But Bauman doesn't just stop there. I mean, his work critiques this idea of modernity. But he also says that, because of global capitalism and electronic technologies and the internet and this concept of risk and mass migration across the globe, this has led to a liquid modernity. And basically what this means is that all those Enlightenment modernity ideas of knowledge as a cure for all social problems have been undone. All of a sudden, scientists, academics, experts take on this ambiguous role because nothing's as fixed anymore. Everything's liquid. Yeah. So nothing really seems like the truth anymore, does it? And I mean, look at the amount of fake news we see on social media. It's a great case of liquid modernity, isn't it? Where all of a sudden, the very scientists who seek the truth are now perceived as being the cause of environmental problems. And it's a difficult one to argue with climate change, isn't it? Because people go, well, you're the one that invented the nuclear bomb. so it leads to public skepticism. And it's also meant that liquid modernity has created all of this uncertainty in regards to employment, education, welfare, the decline of the job for life, the increasing use of temporary employment contracts like 0 hours. And you find that as an individual now, and everyone listening in will hopefully be probably thinking the same, is that you've got to continue your own education to be marketable now, haven't you?
Yes.
Because those jobs aren't for life. And in this liquid modernity, we're seeing things like you've got to, keep building yourself. It's much more about the individual and less about the solid modernity, which was about the institution. And that's because the welfare state has been retreating. It's been purposely scaled back. So those things we rely on to hold on to cling on to, are no longer there. And this liquid state leads to deep uncertainty for some people. And, this isn't all bad. There have been what Bauman famously says, winners and losers in liquid modernity. There are those who have benefited from capitalism, benefited from this progress. And, these are socially privileged individuals who can float around the world as much as they wish. In fact, he calls them tourists. They can tour the internet. They can take transnational flights. They can span the entire globe. And they can actually live in the most favorable conditions in this world, where standards of living are the highest, and, life is good. And that's kind of what we might call some of our richer people in richer nations to a certain extent, and certainly our elite. But in opposition to this, in liquid modernity, are the vagabonds, what he famously called them, those who haven't benefited from this progress, haven't benefited from modernity. In fact, they're immobile. They are excluded from the consumer culture that we see around us. They're geographically located. They're often in places of poor employment or war-torn or unstable and inhospitable environments in some cases. So there's clear winners and losers under globalization, isn't there? This transnational flow of people contributes to this instability because naturally, and I would too, if I was a vagabond, I would want to seek a better life elsewhere. And so that is what globalization and modernity teaches us. Now, would we go back to some of those early thinkers now, the early modernists who were idealistic about the future and go, by the way, all this led to rising levels of inequality in rich and poor, potentially the Holocaust, the dropping of nuclear bombs on Hiroshima. The list goes on. Is this progress? This is an interesting one.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the argument from Bauman. We've moved from solid to liquid modernity. Has this been a good thing for us or not? And it's backed up with other authors as well, like Anthony Giddens. He says that, he calls this late modernity rather than liquid modernity. He says that societies are, newly individualized and they have different relationships to previous societies under solid modernity. In fact, he says it's so unpredictable and it's so out of control that he likens it to riding on the back of a juggernaut that's moving at fast pace, and you can't direct it, or it's not easily directed because there is no one controller under this new way of being. And so it can be, as he says, because he's quite optimistic really about late modernity. He's not necessarily a pessimist. He says this is, whilst you face uncertainties, and you place trust in these weird abstract systems like invisible money floating around the world. He also says this is exhilarating and it's rewarding. And actually, you don't have to be stuck in your little town for the rest of your life like people used to be. You can actually see the globe if you're privileged enough. But he calls this, this concept of a runaway world where there is no one controller. It's just riding on the back of that juggernaut and seeing where we go.
Yeah. No, I was going to say it also sort of brings up a few of the ideas of Ulrich Beck as well, who talks about risk society. And of course, if you take the idea of risk, that does have a negative, but it has a positive as well, doesn't it? If you enact in risky business, sometimes that's exciting. It's not always a negative aspect of risk, is there?
Absolutely. And as Beck and people like Bauman and Giddens wrote at a similar time. And so, yeah, it's very much like this concept of risk. Risk doesn't have to be bad. Risk can also protect us. In a global world where we may face ideologies and concepts such as terrorism, sometimes risk can be a thing that can actually help societies. So there's an argument there to say, are we taking it too far with, the old argument about health and safety and concepts of risks on individual levels? But it is definitely something that doesn't always necessarily have to be bad. We face a world around us now which is prone to things like Ebola and COVID and, all of these types of things. Having those risks in place is acknowledging of them is really important.
And I know this is really difficult, Drew, because you've mentioned modernity, late modernity or liquid modernity, and then post-modernity. I know the textbooks might argue on this, but in terms of dates, what are we talking? In the Western world, what would we consider to be modernity, late modernity?
Ooh,
it's tough, isn't it?
Okay, I know. I would say maybe in a and I could be pulled apart for this. That I would say that kind of period of modernity, probably from about the about 1800, starting around about there in the early seeds of it, although it has seeds going right back historically.
Yeah.
But from about 1800, I would say, from leading to the Industrial Revolution, probably right up to about, I'm going to go with Bauman's idea of the Holocaust notion and go up to, say, World War II. What I would then suggest is that from about the late 1970s, mid to late, we begin to hit this period of a late modernity that starts to emerge. And that was largely through neoliberalism and, the retreat of the state and all of the golden days of the state being all-encompassing have started to vanish, haven't they? This is what Foucault talks about, yes. That withdrawal of the state and all that kind of stuff. And so power has changed. And so from about that period, I would say, until now, we could regard this as liquid late modernity. Other authors would disagree.
Yeah.
So other authors who are postmodernists would probably say that from the late 80s to the 1990s and onwards, we're hitting more of a postmodern society. And they would probably argue very differently. So, I mean, there's some great works originally from some of the postmodernists, which is a lot more difficult to understand for people who are, initially coming into theory. But it's this idea that we've entered this time period where that modernist concept of truth has gone. It's a much more critical, anxious way of seeing the world. And I can see why postmodern writers have said this, because we do seem to live in this anxious world.
Yes.
Where maybe we've, through moving to this liquid times, there's a loss of faith in this idea of progress. Maybe that end chapter of the book doesn't exist. Maybe there are thousands of books, and it just keeps continuing. This idea that we're heading toward one true path, and we all have the same universal goals, and we all have the same equality and justice, and the full picture of knowledge is, to postmodernists say, is absolute rubbish.
Yeah.
Instead, what we see in front of us are multiple pathways, a plurality. We see diversity and difference. We'll never know all true knowledge out there. We can't ever gain that complete picture. And they're deeply skeptical of anybody who does or claims to have true knowledge of everything. So it's not this linear thing. It's a series of networks and flows and all this kind of fascinating stuff that could fry your head the more you thought of it.
Yes.
In fact, can I give an example if that's okay?
Yeah, please do, yeah.
Okay, so an example I often use is from Baudrillard. Baudrillard comes up with this concept of a simulacrum, which is this how modern life is devoid of depth and originality and reality. So what's happened is that we've entered a postmodern society. There's no more new ideas. There's no truth. So what we do is just simply borrow ideas, piece them together into a pastiche of stuff, and reform new things. It's an old argument I had with my own university lecturer when I was at uni back in the days, when my university lecturer said there's only about 5 really original ideas and everything else is an offshoot of them. But back then, maybe my more optimistic times, I was like, no, there isn't. There's loads of them. But this is a postmodern world. So this simulacrum is, Baudrillard noticed that we've even managed to kind of present this world which is seen as real to us by electronic media, by social media and mass media. And commercialism, and we're fed fake diets, and what reality is can change from one day to another. And he watched at the time when he was writing in the 80s. He saw films about the Vietnam War, and the Vietnam War, such as Apocalypse Now and Platoon, and all of those classic Hollywood films presented the Vietnam War as if it was not a failure of the US state and its foreign policy, but the war ended simply because the soldiers went nuts. Now, if you watch those films, that's pretty much the ending. I mean, that's so to the US public who view electronic media and watch films, they're getting a version of history which is entirely pastiche and placed together and fake. And this is what Baudrillard meant by this simulacrum. It's presented as real to us. The soldiers went crazy and they were airlifted out there, but not one mention is mentioned in there that the USA never won that war. Yet, in policy and in the way it's presented in history, it's presented as if they did.
Yeah. It uses that term hyperreality as well, doesn't it? What we're seeing. Was it also Baudrillard that said that about the Gulf War, that our understanding of the Gulf War only came from media images, so they could be completely distorted, couldn't they?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, we see this all around us, don't we? There's a great example of, which I give when I'm teaching this to students. I often use the example of Disney World. Disney World's a brilliant simulacrum because, I mean, is it a real castle or a fake castle? I mean, people go into this world to be swept away under a non-reality. Is things like Made in Chelsea. I was hypnotized. I mean, I'll admit I've only ever seen one episode. I found it horrendous. But I watched it and somebody said, "Did you know this is partially scripted?"
Yeah. Yeah.
And I was like, what do you mean? Partially scripted? And they said, well, it's kind of all set up. And I was like, so is it real or is it not? And this feels all of a sudden like I've entered the world of post-modernity. And it's just, these are just great examples, I think. There's another one where a friend of mine used to work for... can I say the name of an organisation?
Yes, that's fine. Yeah.
Right. We used to work for the restaurant Frankie and Benny's, and it's set up to be like the inside of a New York or Chicago style pizzeria, isn't it? Inside, and there's all these black and white photographs of Frankie and Benny all across the place, and I was like, this is interesting. And my friend who worked for them went, it's fascinating because none of it exists. Frankie and Benny were never real. Those photographs are random people. And I was like, wow, it's as if Baudrillard sat here having a pizza with me.
I heard similar to, the brand Jack Wills.
Yes.
Jack Wills doesn't exist, and people just came up with a name which sounded terribly British. I thought, there's all these people walking around with Jack Wills on, assuming it's a person or a fashion designer, but it's not the case.
It's fascinating. In many ways, it's lended us open to new ways of being, though. So liquid modernity and post-modernity in particular aren't necessarily nihilist, as if nothing exists in the background. And so we must all be depressed if nothing's real. Because this comes with positives as well. I mean, when you think about how revolutionary, as some postmodernists have said, when it comes to gender, it's enabled us to, be gender fluid, and for gender to be revealed as a social construct that modernity had set it up to be. And that, we can play with gender, like Judith Butler famously said. It's performative, that we perform gender. That opens up huge emancipation for men and women to not be tied to these old-fashioned ideas. And for, trans people to find space under post-modernity to be. And so I think there's a lot of good that's come of it as well. I don't think it's necessarily all bad and all, everything's relative and everything can be deconstructed, as Derrida said. And I think there's some interesting things. So another example, if I may?
Yes, please.
Is this concept of art. When you look at the sociology of art, it's fascinating. I mean, what is art has always been a controversial question, hasn't it? But I look at when we now buy graffiti, people pay millions to take a chunk of a Banksy graffiti piece off a wall and keep it in their home. Can we get any more postmodern than that? It's just really interesting. And when we're thinking about, some of the classic theories like Marxism and functionalism and, all those grand theories that try to explain how the whole world operates, postmodernism pulls them up and says, no, that's not how things are, and deconstructs their arguments and pulls them apart and says, these big grand theories don't work if you shift your worldview over to another country.
Yeah. It's what Baudrillard called the breakdown of the meta-narratives, wasn't it?
Yes, exactly. I was about to say that actually.
Oh,
Took
sorry,
the
I
words out of my
interrupted
mouth. No, it's great. All these things I think are just fascinating, and I think we've seen this flow where modernity was very confident, wasn't it? It had all the answers. It reveled in reason and science and human ability. But then all of a sudden this anxious cousin emerges of post-modernity, where it goes, hang on, I'm full of questions. I wallow in nihilistic angst and everything's relative and you can't claim any truth. And there is social reasons behind this. I mean, this mood, this much more anxious mood, has been fueled by, devastation of 2 world wars. We started to see these philosophies of despair and nihilism become much more popular. During the 60s and 70s, we saw attitudes which were against authority and the establishment emerge, through the hippie movements and civil rights movements, which produced a much more overwhelmingly negative effect on Western nations. And a positive one for progress, but a negative one in that all that was solid seems to have faded away. And so we've seen shifts in marriage and divorce rates and cohabitation, and all those things have effects, don't they? And so you can see why Bauman said we went from this kind of solid to liquid state.
Yeah.
So it's all very fascinating stuff. It really is. It makes you wonder who you are.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because if you're a man born in a certain period, let's say in the Western world, you knew exactly what your role was. You were a man, you were the provider, you were the protector, you didn't look after the children, you didn't do the housework. You probably believed in God, you probably believed you went to heaven or hell, you probably believed you came from Adam and Eve, so you weren't questioning everything. Now, that could be seen as limiting, but also that is less anxiety-ridden, isn't it?
Well, that's it. And I think this theme of loss is something that postmodernism has given us as, I don't know if I should call it as a gift, but this concept of loss feeds into social change. So Brexit is a good example of this. Where people feel that by further ingraining ourselves into the EU, we have lost something that was once solid. And so a common refrain, when the peak arguments about Brexit were going on was, we'll not see the Queen's face on notes, which was ridiculous anyway. But it's that fear of loss, and I feel that this has also happened globally. So groups like Daesh or ISIS believe that a loss has happened, a once solid modernity has been lost, and so there needs to be a return to what they perceive that loss to be. Whether that's true or not, it's not true, but it's that idea, isn't it, that you can hold on to those in a really uncertain juggernaut world, a postmodern world, some might argue, that we've lost something in it, and that has real world effects when you think about it.
It does. I mean, it's quite worrying if you think the position we're in at the moment. We sit down to the TV to watch quote unquote experts in terms of politicians and scientists, and our first thought is probably, I don't believe you.
Yeah.
Now if that was even 40, 50 years ago, you would put your faith and trust in those experts and politicians and people at the top.
It's very true. It comes with that, when the early globalization theorists were talking about things like globality and how globalization and even postmodernism potentially could bring a sense of a global community that, and with, run by experts, run by science and scientific methods and the social sciences, that has been lost. And increasingly we do see people as, well, what do they know? And in fact, I got this brilliant meme, which was sent to me on social media, which says, study for 3 years, do a master's degree, PhD for 3 years, and someone online calls you stupid. Yeah. Because I've read a Wikipedia page. Yes. But there's truth in that. In this anxious world that we're living, the late modernity, post-modernity has had an effect on us.
Yeah. It's interesting, isn't it? Because I often say to my students, they're probably going to do a job that at the moment doesn't exist, and that plays with their head a little bit, because that is the world we live in. Like you said, it's not get a job and a job for life with a set company. They probably will be doing something that at the moment doesn't even exist in the world, which is quite a bizarre thought.
That's very true. And it's increasingly a connected world.
Yes.
And it's something I'm often saying to students, we have to recognize the power of globalization and as Castell's called it, our network society. And just having all of this knowledge means that as a graduate going out into that world, you increasingly have to have a global outlook. And, we can't just navel gaze at the UK and only the UK. We have to see how actually we're all deeply connected. And these theories aren't just, far-flung theories written by somebody in an academic office. This is real-world stuff happening to us.
Yeah.
And I think it's, having that knowledge out there and having a global awareness of things really will do you well in the world.
Yeah, and I think it's amazing as well that when you look at those writers, as you said, a lot of them were writing in the 80s and their predictions were staggeringly accurate.
Yeah, they really were. I hold a deep personal regard for people like Bauman because I think, this concept, this whole idea of liquid modernity seems to be very true. The one critique of maybe post-modernity I would advance would be, have we lost all forms of truth? I think we could maybe contest that one.
Yeah.
I think, in terms of identity, maybe we do hold on. Maybe, yes, we're always changing. It's, we're not the same person from birth to death. But I do think there are certain core identities that we might cling on to that make us us. I do still think people like stability of institutions and forms. So, the postmodern stuff would reject all that, wouldn't it? It would say, well, it all can be pulled apart and there's nothing when you pull it all apart there. It's like an onion with nothing in the middle. And I'm not convinced about that. And because from a personal level, as an activist myself, then, well, what would I aim for then? What's the point? And that becomes the nihilist bit, doesn't it?
Yes.
Of why should I bother doing things? Why get out of bed in the morning if I can just, sit there and ponder that my bed doesn't exist?
I wonder, Drew, if we don't like the idea of no truths because that's just a bit too scary.
Well, do you know what? There's that as well,
Yeah.
but it does come with scary thoughts, and you can see why, can't you? How people hold on to that solid modernity stuff and very often romanticize it as well. I mean, it wasn't around for very long, and even then it was in deep flux. But and many of it can be contested. But you can see why people rest on that and go, oh, things were better in the day. And my nana used to say this. She used to say, oh, I could leave my door open and everything was great. And I used to be like, I said, Nana, you lived through looting in World War II. you lived through the great, depression. You saw people starve to death in neighborhoods, really serious stuff, but we tend to romanticize that concept of solid modernity. But that's, some would argue, post-modernity at work.
Yes.
False narratives, false truths, all these ideas. It's fascinating stuff, Matthew. It really is.
Well, the more you read postmodernism, the more it makes your head hurt, actually.
Yeah, it does.
As you've been talking, I've just been jotting down some of the names you mentioned. I just wondered if there was anyone else that you would suggest students would look at. So you've mentioned Foucault, Baudrillard, Bauman, Castells, Giddens. Is there anyone else that you think students could type into Google and learn more about?
Yeah, and I would suggest doing some kind of very introductory bits for some of these because they're not always the best writers. and this comes from, French linguistics, so it isn't always easy to access. But another name I would suggest would be Derrida. Derrida's a really interesting one because I don't think he would like to have been called a postmodernist, really, and he kind of denied it when he was asked, a bit like Foucault. Foucault refused to be called anything. But he's an interesting one because he talks about binaries, and this can be quite empowering. So if you were to write on a piece of paper different binaries, so male, female, white, black, rich, poor, all that type of stuff, what Derrida pointed out, and I find this really interesting, is that on one of those sides of the binaries, that group have power. The rich, the white, the male. You can keep going down with those binaries all the way. The normal, the insane.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And when you start to deconstruct those binaries and pull them apart and reveal that actually all this is just a mass of social constructions, what tells us who is rich and why we should look up to that, should we really? And it tells us where privilege lies. It can be quite an empowering process, but ultimately it still veers on postmodernism. So, what's left is nothing, and which, again, as we're talking about, can be a little bit heart-rending, but it's still an interesting thing to do. Pull apart binaries and do Derrida's method of deconstruction, and then you really see where power lies. So I'd recommend him.
Okay. Yeah, that's another one to get your head hurting, definitely.
Yeah, it is.
And maybe we could just finish with some other key words that you'd associate with postmodernism. So you've mentioned globalization, hyperreality, breakdown of meta-narratives, simulacrum. Is there any other words that you would see as fundamental to understanding postmodernism?
Yeah, I think for me, performativity is a big one because I'm a fan of Judith Butler. I think, and of course, I teach a lot about sexuality and a lot about gender as well. So it's naturally that's going to come into the equation. But performativity is always a good one, and obviously key to this is always uncertainty as well, isn't it? But yeah, the performativity, this concept that gender is not necessarily performance. It's something that we do so many repeated times that we take it as normal and natural. And I think that in itself is a fascinating thing to look at. So when you're exploring concepts of gender, and what gender is a brilliant topic. And it takes me back to my university days again. Sorry, Matthew, I'm going off topic a bit.
No, that's
takes me back to my university days where I was given my hardest ever essay question. It was for a feminist theory and gender studies class. And the essay question was, what is woman? Wow. And I was like, huh? Well, I know what a woman is. And then actually, when I started to deconstruct it using Derrida and then looked at Judith Butler's performativity, I was like, actually, what is woman? Is woman something that we construct? And yes, it's something that's repeated so many times we view it as natural. Is it biologically sexed? Is it? And it threw my head open to this whole world of postmodernism, and I ended up even writing my dissertation on it. But it's just fascinating stuff. And so, yeah, they are the things I would recommend having a look at, definitely.
That's great. Thank you. It's definitely, of all the theories, it's probably the one that would get you thinking the most. Would you say? Is that a fair thing to say?
Definitely fair, yes. Yeah. Its closest thing that we have around us in some ways is Buddhism. Weirdly enough. And although, because Buddhism has that belief that, behind everything is just craving. And so there's some really interesting things around Buddhism, which has, it's probably the closest thing to it in terms of religion, I would say. Although postmodernists wouldn't like that.
Yes, exactly. There is no religion. There is no truth. There is nothing.
Yeah, exactly. Get used to it. That's what you've got.
Do we even exist, Drew? Are we even doing this podcast? That's what we need.
I haven't got a clue.
Thank you so much for your time today, Drew. I also wanted to urge people to go back and listen to your interview as well that we did a couple of months ago. Do you just want to say a little bit about what it is that you do so they can go back and listen to that?
Yeah, by all means. I mean, I'm researching all areas, mainly kind of inequalities. But we had a fantastic talk about LGBT Muslims and what that means for them as well. So do go back and have a look at that talk. That would be brilliant.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for your time today, Drew. And I hope we haven't sent people mad talking about reality and simulacrum, etc.
I hope not. I hope you've enjoyed it.
Thank you. Cheers, Drew.
Thanks, Matthew.
Thank you. Bye.
Cheers. Bye.
If you are a regular listener to The Sociology Show, then you could help with the costs of promoting and hosting the podcast. If you can spare even a small amount, then you can donate on the GoFundMe.com website by searching for The Sociology Show. There is no obligation, of course, and all future downloads will continue to be free. A huge thank you to all those that have already donated. Your kind gesture will help to continue keep the show going and growing. Best wishes and keep enjoying the show.
Thank you for taking the time to listen to the podcast. If you would like to contact the show or be interviewed, then please email thesociologyshowpodcast@gmail.com.